Welcome everybody to Federation Square. This is the next in the Archbishop's conversations. We start by acknowledging the original custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Elizabeth Murray. I'm the Assistant Curate at the Anglican Parish of St Silas and St Anselm in Albert Park, and it's my pleasure to be your MC today. The topic for the conversation is Where Can I Sleep Tonight? Homelessness in Australia. Archbishop Philip Freier is joined today by Jason Russell and Tony Nicholson. Jason Russell is an Aboriginal elder of the Birrabri Nation, a former firefighter and someone who experienced homelessness for almost a decade. Today, he helps the homeless through volunteer work with Anglicare and the Lazarus Centre, as well as helping the more well-to-do to understand the issues surrounding homelessness through his work with the Council for Homeless Persons Peer Education Support Program. Please make Jason welcome. Tony Nicholson has dedicated over 30 years to improving conditions of those living on or close to the edges of society. A feature of his work has been his ability to collaborate with colleague social justice organisations, governments and businesses to achieve reform in public policy and service delivery to the benefits of disadvantaged Australians. Tony is currently Executive Director of the Brotherhood of St Laurence here in Melbourne. He has a strong record of service development and innovation, research and policy analysis and compelling advocacy. In January this year, Tony commenced in the part-time role as chair of the state government's rough sleeping strategy, working with agencies on the ground to build long-term sustainable strategies to reduce rough sleeping in Victoria. Please make Tony welcome. And today's conversation moderator is Barney Schwartz. Barney was an age journalist for 32 years and worked as letters editor, opinion editor, chief sub-editor and religion editor, the latter for the last 12 years of his time with Fairfax. Winning several awards, he covered 2 papal conclaves in Rome, the clergy a sexual abuse crisis, and issues surrounding Islam, among other subjects. He retired in 2013, but still writes about classical music and opera for the Sydney Morning Herald and Age, and has a regular faith column for the Sunday Age. Now, Barney Schwartz is a Senior Fellow of the Centre for Public Christianity and a media consultant to the Anglican Primate of Australia, Melbourne Archbishop Philip Freier. He's married to author Morag Schwartz, with whom he has 4 children. Welcome, Barry.
Jason, I would like to start with you, if that's okay. How did you become homeless?
Well, I was misdiagnosed schizophrenic. I actually had bipolar and ADHD. And my life sort of started getting fractured. So work, home, kind of fell apart. And I distanced myself into isolation. And to deal with that isolation, I started to self-medicate with speed.
How old were you at the time?
How old? I was probably 38.
Okay. So you were a firefighter before this happened?
Yes, yeah. I was in my early 20s, a lifetime ago. Yeah, I was a firefighter with Gospel City Fire Control.
And your life spiralled out of control?
Yes, it did. What probably compounded the problem was I was my brigade's counsellor. And you can't counsel yourself, so I was probably my own worst enemy.
And what happened to you? Was it in Melbourne that this took place? And how did you survive?
No, I spent 7 years on the streets of Sydney.
Sydney?
Yeah, in and out of squats. Speed, I kind of, if you can manage a drug addiction, it was, I could still function. Once ice made its appearance, it is a devastating drug. It takes charge of everything in your life. And I started using drugs to survive on the streets after my social and work life fell apart.
And you say you were in squats, also on sleeping on the street, and
Yeah, squats on the streets. I've never begged for 1 cent in my life. Even then I had pride. But in Sydney I had too many connections, dealers and the people associated with drugs. So I wanted to remove myself from that environment. As someone once said, some battles are won by not participating. So I removed myself from New South Wales. I came to Victoria looking for hope and some kind of future.
is it terrifying to be homeless?
What a lot of people don't take into account, it is terrifying, but it is crushingly embarrassing to put your hand up and say, I'm homeless. It's like saying you're broken or you're damaged and terrifying. I don't scare easy, but yeah, I've seen some pretty horrific things on the streets.
Tony, how typical is Jason's story?
It's atypical, actually. If you look at the data about the numbers of people who are rough sleeping, and we have pretty good data about that through the ABS, of all the people who experience some form of homelessness, only about 10% do so on the street, that is rough sleeping, and of those, a minority do so for long periods of time. So in that sense, Jason's experience was similar to a minority of people who rough sleep. So for the majority of people who experience rough sleeping, you find that it's a relatively short period. That's not to say it's not dangerous or degrading, it is. But it's a relatively short period of some weeks rather than months. But what you do find is that those people who have longer periods of rough sleeping, generally that correlates with a mental health problem or an addiction of some sort, often that has its origins in some form of trauma.
What then are the principal causes of homelessness? Jason's story is obviously an extreme one, but I was reading the other day that there are many elderly women who don't have superannuation, who are living in their cars now, which is obviously an extremely sad situation. Can you talk us through the principal causes?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to understand that those folks that find themselves without shelter are literally on the street. Just the tip of the iceberg of the phenomenon of homelessness in our society. So they're about 10% of all people who experience homelessness. There's a whole lot of other people in various circumstances that might be residing in crisis accommodation. They may be in caravan parks, they may be sleeping in their cars, they may be very temporarily put up with friends or couch surfing. So this is a very broad and large phenomenon of which the folk you find on the street are just really the tip of that iceberg. So when we're thinking about homelessness in its full breadth, you find that it affects a diverse range of people. But there are really, to my mind and experiences, there are three main causes. The first is family violence. So if we were able to eliminate family violence overnight, you would eliminate about 40% of homelessness. About 40%. That's how significant that is. So typically that's women and children who are the victims of violence from men who find themselves homeless. But it's also young people that are squeezed out of homes, etc. So that's one big cause. The second big driver of the phenomenon of homelessness is employment and unemployment. So the best way to be resilient in the housing market is to have a job. But here in Victoria, we find that there's about 200,000 people who are unemployed, of whom about 40,000 have been unemployed for longer than a year. So that means if you don't have the support of family or friends, you're solely reliant upon a Centrelink income, a New Start income, which with all the assistance available from Centrelink, it's about $47 a day. So what this means is the problem that a lot of single people are facing is they have to make choices between whether they find accommodation and pay for it or whether they meet their other the necessities of life, like feeding themselves. This is how bad it has got in Australia. So there's that issue of unemployment that predisposes people to the situation of homelessness. And then thirdly is the issue of housing costs. So thinking about that single unemployed person, solely reliant upon a Centrelink income, of all the lettings in the private rental market in Victoria over the last year, only 0.5% of those lettings was able to be afforded by that single person. So that's how desperate it's become. So such is the high cost of housing, particularly in metropolitan Melbourne.
Yeah, extraordinary. Archbishop, turning to you, Jesus said, as you well know, that the poor you have always with you. What is the Christian responsibility in this area of homelessness, and how does it compare with the states? Do we bring anything extra to the equation?
Yeah, I think it's a part of the litmus test of what kind of society we are, and I think as Tony's indicated, we've merged into a society where some of the things we thought were a good safety net, so people could survive and live a decent life, really are at the borderline or below the level of how they can do that decently. So I think that there's a significant issue about the vision of the kind of society we have, which of course our Christian faith informs. And I think it's because of that quite a lot of our parishes do have increasingly compassionate ministries to people who are homeless or people who are on the edge, people who, even if they, making the choices, as Tony said, if they made a choice to fund their housing, they're unable to fund their food. So we've got significant engagement just through the compassionate ministry of parishes, and possibly some people who are here who might want to comment about what they do later. But it's, I think as a Christian community, we're very conscious that we want to be part of a solution to this, but we know that there are structural solutions that really are the whole of society, as well as the generous or compassionate actions of individuals.
Christian agencies are very important in this arena, though, aren't they? Such as the Brotherhood of St. Laurence and Anglican. They're working very hard in this area. Are you confident that we're going to continue to be able to maintain that sort of ministry?
Well, I think they are very important, and also it's very important that we get support from government, because there's emergency food relief provisions that's available from state government, and in many of our parishes which access those emergency food provisions through Anglican, that they're quickly exhausted because the need is very great. So I think that depending where you look in Melbourne, and this is the paradox, we see something of the tip of the iceberg here in the CBD, but I've been to rural Victoria. I was speaking to a Rotary conference up in Shepparton at a very nice convention centre in Shepparton, but obviously just walking outside, there were a couple of guys sleeping just in the hedge. You could sort of see their swags. So I think this issue of homelessness or poor housing security is right across our Victorian community. And it's something that, in a way we can see a bit of it and extrapolate from that, but there's a much deeper and I think a properly structural issue which really goes to the heart of how we view how it is decent for people to live in our society, and what we do to ensure they can live in decency, have proper choices, because I think, as talking to Jason, it's not a great life. It brings out the the worst of your personality, not the best. We want to see people flourish with the best of their nature, being able to contribute to society.
Tony, you said that only about 10% are actually sleeping rough, that most are couch surfing or in crisis centres or so on, and most are not on the CBD. Where are they?
Yes, that's a very, very important point, actually. The work that I've been doing for the state government, I've found that the vast majority who experience rough sleeping in Victoria do so in the suburbs and in country towns. So about 2/3 of all the people who experience rough sleeping do so in the suburbs of the country towns. So what we see in central Melbourne aren't folk that live in central Melbourne and fallen on hard times. They tend to be people that have drifted towards the city centre as their life circumstances have deteriorated. And that's largely due to the perception that there are services available to them in central Melbourne. And when you get into some of the suburbs and into country towns, the services are scant, the prevalence is high. And that's part of the strategy that we're now compiling, is proposing that, in fact, we need to intervene much earlier in the circumstances that people experience. But you can only do so if you have service infrastructure out in the suburbs and in country towns. Building more service infrastructure in central Melbourne will just exacerbate the problem in central Melbourne as people drift in towards those services.
So you're helping the state government develop a statewide strategy. How's that going, and when do you think we're going to see some results from that?
Well, I'm due to hand to the Housing Minister a high-level strategy by the end of October. So we're very much in that stage now of working out what we think needs to be done. I've talked about the importance of building service infrastructure in locations in the suburbs and in country towns. I think there's a big opportunity to intervene earlier in other allied service systems. So, for example, people who have been in hospital are being discharged onto the streets without shelter. People that have been in some form of custody are being discharged. That's one of the big challenges, is how do we ensure that these other major service systems understand and are alert to circumstances of homelessness. And whilst my report is to the state government, there is a very, very significant issue within Centrelink and within the various employment assistance agencies that are responsibility of the Commonwealth Government, because those services simply aren't working for people who are rough sleeping at the moment.
Yes, I think anybody would dread falling into the hands of Centrelink from what we hear.
I have great sympathy for the Centrelink staff. They're under enormous pressure, such as the high volume of work that they're expected to carry out. The reality is that a lot of the people who experience homelessness, that hasn't been identified by people within Centrelink. And when it has, and they're referred to employment agencies, they're not getting the support that they need. One of the really important pieces of data that I was surprised about that came out of this piece of work is that roughly half of all the people who are experiencing rough sleeping are deemed by Centrelink to be actively in the labour market. So this is people that are on New Start or a youth allowance. So you have people that don't have shelter and have very little resources, but they are subject to the rules and regulations of Centrelink that they should be looking for work, attending job interviews, etc. So this is there's a big area of reform needed within Centrelink.
Yes, yes. Jason, when you were homeless, what did you want most from other people? Was one of the worst parts you described as the embarrassment? Did you feel that you were invisible on the street?
Oh, very, very much so. When I do presentations on understanding homelessness, I pose the question, could anybody describe the last homeless person they saw? Colour of the shirt, what hat they were wearing? And most people can't. I'm immersed in the homelessness situation, and I couldn't even tell you. But yeah, I think it's the fear of what possibly you could become, and that's what I run with in my bio on it can happen to anyone. You know, I was a trained firefighter, done Army cadets. I was prepared for something to go wrong. But yeah, just the weight of the embarrassment of being on the streets and being invisible was probably the worst. It was the worst thing that could possibly happen.
So what turned it around for you? You referred to the desperation of the addiction, but if it were just a matter of willpower, there would be nobody homeless. What turned it around?
The catalyst of me getting back on my feet would have to be Anglican St. Mark's drop-in community centre. They gave me something that I didn't experience for more than a decade, was a form of respect. And as a child, I was raised on a simple set of rules, and one of them, or one I like the most, is that wood ain't going to chop itself. If you want fire, you got to chop wood. If you want a coffee, you got to put effort in. So when I presented at St. Mark's, before I even touched one crumb of bread or a drop of coffee, I went and done some dishes. And that moment, I don't know when exactly, I lost my self-respect, but I knew the second I found it. And I was up to my elbows, dirty dishes, washing them for the homeless. One of the homeless guys came and patted me on the back, goes, "Wow, man, good on you for trying." You know, and I can see you, you know, I can see what you're doing. And just that simple sentence, "I can see you," it laid the foundations of where I am today. You know, like, not even 4 years ago, I was homeless, mental health problems, and a drug addiction. Fast forward 3 years, I'm here advocating for the innocent members of our community.
I have read that one of the hard things is if you're begging in the streets and people just don't look at you. They may drop money in the hat or whatever, but they don't look and they just walk on. Is that true? For us here, how should we interact with homeless people on the street?
Okay. Personally, I would rather eat out of a garbage can before I ask for anything, any help. It's just the pride that's in me. And if I do, which I do on many occasions, cross the paths of somebody, say, begging for change, I would ask, what drop-in centre do you frequent? And then I would make a cash donation to that drop-in centre, just to remove all variables, because I've been on that side of the fence and had a outrageous, so say it mildly, drug addiction. Every cent I got went towards my drug addiction, because I wouldn't beg and I wouldn't steal for it. I would ask them where they present, and I would make a donation there, or I'd go and volunteer there. But the least thing I would do is take 5 seconds to get down to eye level and say hello. Minimum. Yeah. That's all it takes is 5 seconds. And who knows, that little glimmer of being seen might start them on the road to recovery or out of homelessness.
Archbishop, the chairman of the UN Human Rights Committee, Sir Nigel Rodley, spoke in 2014 about the criminalization of homelessness in the US. He said, "I'm simply baffled by the idea that people can be without shelter in a country and then be treated as criminals for being without shelter. The idea of criminalizing people who don't have shelter is something that I think many of my colleagues would find as difficult as I do to even begin to comprehend." Recently, of course, we've seen camps of homeless people forcibly moved on in both Sydney and Melbourne, at Martin Place and outside Flinders Street Station. And the media coverage of that, certainly in News Limited, was very negative. Here were drug-addicted thugs who were a menace to society and needed to be moved on. Is it a problem when we criminalise homelessness? Is there a better way of looking at it?
Oh, I think it's always unhelpful to project even more negativity on people whose lives, as we've heard, they're not thriving, they're getting no enjoyment out of their life, they're not able to contribute. So I think projecting more negativity is not helpful. I think it's difficult for legislators, especially in local government, when there are campaigns mounted in the press and on the radio. There's, people want a quick fix, and I think it is difficult. I had a very encouraging message from the Lord Mayor, who would have been keen to be here this morning. He's at other events, and I know that he's been very keen to try and find another way, but there's a lot of pressure on local municipal authorities to get quick fixes. And I think, as we can see, there's something there's something more than making the issue less visible. Making it invisible won't make the challenges the people are enduring, low housing security, any less. So I think we've got to be a bit more serious about ourselves as a society in wanting to really engage with the deeper questions. Look, I had an experience of this many years ago when I was in a country town in Queensland as a priest. Had a man who came, and probably in those days the usual thing people would say, "Oh, have you got $5 or something?" And I used to just routinely do it with Jason said. I'd always say, "Look, I'm not going to give you any money. I'm going to go and I'll take you to lunch. We'll have a talk." And I took this guy for lunch. We had a talk, and it turned out he'd been working fruit picking, had low literacy, had a lot of money owed to him, but he didn't really know how to advocate to get his money back. And so he was a man who didn't need to beg, because he had someone that actually scammed him from the money he'd earned from his sweat. So I was able to put him in contact with some people who could advocate and get his money. And so he was, he wasn't. So I think that we've really got to spend the time not putting our efforts into making people invisible, but putting our time into understanding what will make the difference and actually seeing that there is some difference, because it really goes to the heart of what kind of society do we want to live in? Because it's there's the old saying, "There for the grace of God go I." Things can change adversely for anyone, and if we have a society where if you fall under some sort of line and then we really ramp up and escalate the hostility, project all the criminality additionally onto you, I just think that's not the kind of society that we owe each other.
Jason, I'd like to ask you how you felt about the media, because you're one of the people who suffers directly when somebody runs a campaign saying these people are a problem, let's get rid of them. That impinges on you very directly. Did you get angry with the media?
That'd be an understatement. I was furious. There was so much more that's involved when someone finds themselves without a home. I'll quote one of my past teammates, because the media has beaten the word homelessness to death. It's lost its impact. Where putting it like a person without a home, it gives you that connection. Like myself, I was a decorated firefighter, a pillar in my community, and I fell on hard times. I think it's up to 14, probably 15% of returning vets from Afghanistan. These people are risking their lives for our freedoms and our liberties. And the media has turned it into, how would I put it? Homelessness in Victoria isn't a young lady smoking drugs on the corner of Flinders Street. That picture got plastered around the world. There's so much more to it. It can really happen to anyone. And the media, can't really shoot the messenger. But what's driving these front page things or events, I think it all goes back down to good news doesn't sell papers. And just attacking the defenceless, innocent is paramount to kicking a puppy. It can't help itself, and sometimes it doesn't even know better. But you got to protect the innocent. No matter how they find up where they are, not criminalise them or plaster them on the front page of newspapers. That's not it. That's not the problem. The answer: affordable housing, a better understanding of what it means to find yourself without a home. I honestly believe in my heart and soul that we can end the homelessness problem in my lifetime. It is such an easy thing to fix. That's just addressing it. And some of my colleagues say if they cured that problem, a lot of people would be out of work. But you know what a better world it would be if we pulled them back to what they've always been. That's part of our community.
Well, I think, Barney, we need the intelligent use of all of the policy tools, not just reverting to the bluntest and most brutal, as we sometimes do. We really have got to commit ourselves to using the range of policy tools in an intelligent way.
And I'd say, Archbishop, you've got to have a long-term perspective on this. It's not going to be solved overnight. My concern about the media coverage is that it causes people to think of people who are experiencing homelessness almost as if they're a different species. Yeah. You know, that they're not like us. And I started my social work career working as a duty social worker in a homeless centre, and over about 5 years I've calculated I would have conducted structured social work interviews with over 4,000 people who were homeless at the time. And one of my reflections about that is that what I found, even in their deepest despair and stress, they aspired to be like you and I. They had very modest mainstream aspirations to be able to work, have a decent place to live and have some sense of family. And I think that's what we've got to remember, that these are people like you and I. They have mainstream aspirations. And that's the problem with the media coverage that I have, is that it just causes us to think of them as others, other than you and I.
Yes. We've just had a conference here last week about homelessness, where the visiting professor from Ireland spoke about the Finland model of affordable housing. Would that work here, do you think? Sorry, explain to us what the Finland model is. First.
Well, essentially, the argument that he put from the experience in Finland was that rather than providing temporary and emergency accommodation, the better solution is simply to build houses for the people who are homeless. Of course, there is an acute lack of affordable housing in Victoria and in Australia. I would seriously offer some cautions about the sort of prescriptions that he is offering. This is an area of social policy that is prone to attract solutions from people from other countries that don't recognise the very different context for the work here in Victoria and in Australia. So if you just thinking about Finland is roughly the same population. I think they're about 5.5 million, so almost a similar population to Victoria. But if you look at other factors, the population growth in Finland is about 0.4% per annum. In Victoria, over the last decade, it's been averaged about 1.8%. Last year, it was over 2%. This is massive population growth. So the challenge of housing, the increase in population in Victoria when compared to Finland is 4 or 5 times greater. Another aspect that needs to be taken into account in Finland and a number of the Scandinavian countries, the unemployment benefit in Finland is struck at about 60% of average weekly earnings. Here in Australia and in Victoria, it's struck at about 23% of average weekly earnings. In Finland, they have the social housing makes up about 14% of total housing stock. Here in Victoria, it's about 3%. So, it's a much bigger challenge, much more complex in Victoria. Frankly, solving homelessness in Finland is a doddle compared with the challenge that we face here, because this is an area with massive population growth, with massive changes in the labour market, many more people long-term unemployed than we've experienced in previous decades. These are policy areas that have been neglected. So, of course, building more housing, and particularly low-cost housing for single people in particular, is a critical part of any solution. But it's a much more complex issue in Australia.
The Archbishop referred to drawing on the wide range of policy areas to find solutions. Clearly, early intervention is important. Where, given the three sorts of homelessness you described, where would that early intervention be best directed?
Well, in terms of the responsibilities of a state government, it's really in the service sectors where identifying people that are at risk of homelessness and responding more quickly. But there are big reforms required that require both Commonwealth and state governments working together. So clearly the whole issue of the inadequacy of the New Start allowance is just appalling, and that needs to be addressed. And I hope those in the political processes that are recognising problems of inequity and inequality in Australian society actually focus on improving that New Start payment. And the whole issue of housing policy, the Victorian government last year, I think had a good start on putting forward a policy that is pretty comprehensive, but you've got to say it's pretty modest. And it's modest because of the neglect of these issues for a long period of time. It's a good start, but it's still very modest.
Okay. Archbishop, besides the structural needs, the churches, the parishes that you refer to, a lot of them are doing a huge amount at the grassroots level, not only providing various forms of immediate welfare, but also community building. And can you tell us a little bit about what you know is happening in Melbourne?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And it's really, as Jason introduced, the St Mark's Centre at Fitzroy, other places. I know we're just sitting down and having a meal with people and having human interaction where your own human dignity is being brought to the fore about the expectation of being in a community and responsible participation. I think that's a really rich thing. It sounds so simple, it sounds so elementary, but I think for many people who are experiencing homelessness, that human contact is not there in the kind of the quality that we need to enhance our life. Places like the Lazarus Centre at St Peter's, Eastern Hill, I know, have some very welcoming programs in the morning for breakfast for people and other things that that follow. So I think there's a natural desire I think many people have to do something that's generous and compassionate, but it all ends up needing to add up to something which fundamentally moves people out of their housing insecurity or their homelessness into something else. And I think that even our compassionate desires have got to run across that grid of where are they contributing to a better outcome. Because I think look around the town, there's a lot of very compassionate things that happen to support people who are experiencing homelessness on the street in the CBD. But I think in our parishes, we're very keen that they be integrated with some of our more professional work through our agencies like the Brotherhood of St Laurence or like Anglican, because there's that taps into some of the resources that can actually give pathways for people. But I think just the ordinary engagement with people in things that enhance human dignity around something as simple as sharing a meal together and being respected in that is a very rich and restoring and a renewing thing for people. And so I'm glad that we offer that. But I'm glad that these activities, which are very grassroots and compassionate, can be linked into something which can do some more adding of value and pathways for people out of their situation.
Could I add to that, Barney? One of the things that I found in this work that I'm doing for the state government is that when people are assisted to get off the street and are provided with accommodation, what is often lacking is a community connectedness. So we provide shelter for them, but we don't provide any community. And I've talked to people that have been homeless and been placed into accommodation, and they actually spend their days coming back onto the street because they don't have any connections in those communities. They don't have any, we all live for and in relationships, and they don't have these relationships. So I think there is an enormous opportunity for the parishes and community groups more generally to get involved in this work simply by being good neighbours, by welcoming people into their community, by perhaps taking them to the men's shed, perhaps taking them to the neighbourhood house or to the local footy and netball club where they might get involved. And I've seen it work so very, very well. It's just wonderful when you see people, ordinary citizens, welcoming people, inviting people to be joined into their cricket club as a scorer or whatever it is. And I think that's it's a wonderful opportunity for parishes to think about simply being good neighbours to people that may be relocated into their communities.
And I think, Barney, just one of the examples, the parish where Elizabeth is serving has an evening hospitality program on a Sunday night, and it really was started with wanting to offer people the best. They got a really good and generous chef who'd worked in significant restaurants to come and make a meal to welcome people. So it really was trying to get past that, a bit like we touched on earlier, this sense of moral failure, that you are in this situation because of, in a way, your own failings. It's almost like a moral stain you have, and the consequence of that is that people will withdraw from you and you will be more isolated. So it's really trying to reverse that narrative, and it's been, I think, a really generous thing to sort of say, what is the best we can do for people in terms of welcome, of hospitality, of enhancing their sense of this is a dignified place, and not just sort of, grudgingly lining up and taking a cold sandwich and heading off back, but they're actually being treated, and in a way wanting, because I think in that way, if we can, it's a strengths-based approach, I suppose. If you can get in touch with any of our own strengths, you can act more constructively in the complex issues you face than if you're in the place of your inadequacy and your weakness. So I think that anything and community does that. It brings out strength in people, it brings out their confidence, it ignites a hope. It links them, as Jason said, with even life narratives from their childhood. They say, look, here's the truth, and I'm getting in touch with that, and that's going to strengthen me. So I think that's just a wonderful thing to do, but it's reframing things, because we can so easily go down the moral failure narrative, and I think that doesn't end good for anyone anywhere.
Yeah. Jason, that's what you're doing at St Mark's, of course. Tell us about that.
I treat St Mark's like it's life support, because as the Archbishop was just said, it is so much more than lining up and getting a meal. We are social creatures by nature, and striving for ritual and belonging. Well, places like the Lazarus Centre, St Peter's and St Mark's, they facilitate that. It's like a family, and they're brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles. And because I've been on both sides of the fence, even though I've been volunteering the whole time, I've seen the power of conversation, being accepted and sitting around sharing a meal. I strongly suggest that our audience visit a drop-in centre and see the impact and power of just a group of people striving for the one thing, belonging, and they're no longer invisible.
Look, we've come to the end of our ordinary time before questions. I'd like to ask each of you, though, if there's anything that you haven't said that you would like to have said just before we move over to questions, starting with you, Tony.
I think that point I was making about the opportunity for ordinary people to get involved in this is very important. But I would add, that it is important that we do it in a integrated way that is part of a broader plan. What I've observed is that often well-meaning people get involved in providing assistance to people on the street, but in a sense, it can lead to simply helping sustain people in a street life. We've got to understand that sleeping rough is very dangerous, it's very degrading, and our objective needs to be to get people out of that situation, not sustain them in that situation. And so it's important that the voluntary effort of so many generous people is harnessed in a productive way, working with the more professional base services, adding reach and depth to those services. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping that will come out of this strategy I give to the state government, is to map out how people can most productively contribute to tackling this problem.
That's very interesting, because I'm probably most of you are a bit like me. When I walk across the Prince's Bridge from Flinders Street Station down towards the Arts Centre, there's almost always 3 people sitting on there with a placard, "Homeless, please help." And before I leave the station, I get 3 $2 coins, and I give one to each one on the way down. That's the wrong strategy. I should be giving it to St Mark's Drop-In Centre because I'm just feeding their drug addiction, you suggest, Jason.
Yeah, if I was going to make like financial contribution, I would certainly ask the centre they frequent. So I'm getting that connection and saying, okay, I'm happy to help you. I would like to remove all variables or temptations. I don't want to fuel anyone's drug addiction, obviously. For that, hey, their social decisions are their own. But if they're asking me for help, the best way I could help, or the best bang for my buck, would be to give it to the centre that they frequent, whether it be Anglican, St Mark's, St Laurence's House of Welcome. There's never enough funding, and there's never enough volunteers. There's always room for more. The message I would like to leave is election time, when it comes around, affordable housing, affordable housing, affordable housing. That's, they've got to, thank you. And I tend to put, sorry, button into your time, sir.
Well.
Thanks. I usually put this to people I take on my tour, and I've done it with students, teachers, even politicians. I say, you are here because you want to make a change. You want to embrace what it means to be homeless. I suggest this. When you get home tonight, you do what you normally do. Pat your pet, water your plants, have your meal, get ready for bed, and put your mobile phone and your tablet on your bed and sleep on the floor next to it. That's homelessness in a nutshell. Everything you love, need, or find comfort is just out of reach. And who can last the longest? I actually got 30 seconds out of a politician, and I do it myself just to remind me, to reinforce or galvanise my resolve on the mission I hopefully we will all raise awareness on. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think my closing comment would be that we need to tap into what are the life-affirming and strengthening visions of the human person we have. I think for Christians, the fundamental perspective that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that frames most of the characteristic of our own perceptions of self and interaction with others. And we're living in a society where even a shared vision of humanity is probably even more conjectured than it has been, but the extent to which we have a generous and a noble vision of humanity, we need to hold to that and project it as part of our expectations of our public discourse and the way we conduct the kind of society we want to live in and want to see happen for others.
Thank you. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Could you please thank all our panellists? So it's now time for questions. Brief questions, please.
Good morning. My name is Winston Fernanda. I'm from St. Aidan's in Noble Park. The homelessness and rough sleeping we've heard about. What about the young children that they produce? Thank you.
My question is about mental health issues. Jason mentioned that part of his problem was a mental health problem. Is there something that the churches can do in advocacy or in practical help in that area?
Perhaps just on the issue of children, homelessness has huge impact on lots of children, simply because women and children escape violent men. And so in terms of the number of people that experience homelessness and come to formal services, large numbers of those are children. The majority of below 12 years of age. And what the service providers are increasingly focusing on is trying to understand the impact of homelessness on those children who have often observed violent family interactions, children that have been cut off from their friends, that have been pulled out of school, often that have lost their pets. It's that traumatic impact on children is something that the service providers are now becoming more aware of and more focused on. Homelessness is very much about the homelessness of children.
Yeah, especially, call me old-fashioned, but I don't think any child should be on the streets. We are just forming their ideology about what's acceptable. And if they were children, think, okay, my society accepted me as being a homeless child, the next is another generation, and so on and so forth. If they're told today it's okay, in 20 years the problem is going to be that much worse. And interaction with the mental health, being in that environment, it is scary, lonely. What I missed the most was interacting with my community. There was groups coming in that would just do normal things, bring in a cut lunch. It's a good environment to do that sort of thing. And just talk about the day. Because they're inside these four walls, getting healed, but they're so off balance because the medication puts you in a very fragile zone. A normal day to us would be a normal week to somebody who finds themselves institutionalised in a mental health wing.
Just on the mental health issue, I'm aware of some very interesting research that's been conducted which demonstrates that mental illness is both a cause and a consequence of homelessness. So for some folk who become mentally ill, they fall into situations of homelessness, but there's very solid research now demonstrating that a prolonged period of homelessness will cause mental illness. And so what we really do need is stronger mental health services more generally, but we also need to ensure that those services that are dealing with the homeless have access to good mental health services. That's something that a number of the organisations in the field have worked hard at, but it's always been a struggle to actually maintain that mental health response capacity, as some of the big health services like to pull it back into hospitals rather than being in the community.
Yeah, I think that when you look at any significant number of people, the scale of which Tony's mentioned here in Victoria, people are going to have all of the range of many issues, dental health issues, mental health issues. There's a whole lot of things that in the routine, ordinary living of life, people assume they can access services that make a difference to your life. But I think in a situation of homelessness or low housing security, trying to live on $47 a day and having to measure everything as an alternative to what your costs are for survival, I think there's many other aspects that fall away, and it's not surprising to me that amongst those things, people are not in a good situation to be compliant or gain medication. In some places I know there have been outreach services with palliative care because there are people who are homeless who have terminal illnesses, experiencing a great pain and not able to access the kind of palliative care that someone in their medical situation might expect. So, range of things, amongst which mental health I think is an important one.
I should mention Anglican Care provides something really unique where they give the carers or nurses that we have come to the breakfast program and access to people who are too embarrassed or don't know any better on where to get mental help. They come to the clients, and I think that's incredible. I take my hat off to these people that go above and beyond to do what they do, but it would never have happened if they didn't have the safe environment that Anglican Care's St Mark's and Lazarus Centre provide.
Thank you for the discussion this morning. My name's Julia Fox. Now, I live in 30 St Andrews Place. And the question I've got for Neil in particular is what exactly is the government planning to do affordable housing and or the local government? Why I ask this in particular very quickly is I live near the Peter Mac site, which the government are now fast-tracking from public use zone to multi-use zone. We have argued in our submissions, can that be part of affordable housing? There are various buildings there. Or the monies from it go to something like affordable housing. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. It's been fantastic. Just from a totally practical point of view, I live in North Melbourne. There's a lot of people on the streets. I'm not in a situation where I can sit down and share a meal with people. I offer to buy food for them often. How do they physically find out where the drop-in centres are? So if I say, what's your closest drop-in centre? Now, I know of a couple in North Melbourne, but if you're not in that society, or, in the suburb, to sit down and say, where's your local drop-in centre, if they don't know where they are, who can then say where you go to find out about them?
The cutting edge on finding out where anything is concerning community or social welfare. The Ask Izzy app, it's Ask IZZY. It's got a really good search engine. You put in, it's easy to say, okay, I'm a single male, I'm looking for a meal. Put in meal, it'll give you the nearest to the furthest, like Google Maps, which is easy when you want a meal. But some of the most versatile or more important uses for this app were young ladies trying to access hygienic products. Some chemists give them away for nothing. But how do you ask that without being crushed by embarrassment? You just have this Ask Izzy app, and it's like that quick to do it.
Ask Izzy.
Ask Izzy.
ASKIZZY.
It's 2 words, yeah. Ask Izzy, ASK. And
it's an iPhone app?
No, it's an app or any phone. The City of Melbourne running it out.
Okay.
I know they're certainly involved with it.
A very useful tip, thank you.
Oh, well, it tells you everything, from I put pumpkin pie on the moon and got a response. It's a really good search engine. And the best thing about is it's a tool you might never have to use. But if you need it, you can pull it out and it'll take 5 New York minutes to do the whole process. And you don't have to carry it on your phone. Once you look it up, it pulls it up and it gives you a search engine on the window.
And Tony, there are some countries that mandate any big project has to have a certain amount of affordable housing.
Yeah, so I think the question really relates to the concept of inclusionary zoning. So this is the idea that governments and councils can require developments to contain a certain proportion of low-cost housing in any development. Generally, governments in Australia have been very, very tentative about going down that path. I don't fully understand why. I think that it is important to ensure that we maintain low-cost housing, particularly in the suburbs that are well serviced by public transport, that have good health facilities and services, and where there's a density of jobs. Because what you find when you look at the distribution of affordable housing, by and large now it's all been forced out into the outer suburbs, into the growth corridors, into country towns. But of course that's a long way from where there are services, from where there's public transport, from where there is a density of jobs. So I certainly believe that the governments have got to be a bit more bolder and go down the path of inclusionary zone.
Just quickly, if you're not tech savvy, the City of Melbourne Council handed out a helping out guide, and that pretty much covers everything that the app would. And it's,
one of the things that, and the app that Jason is talking about is great. One of the things that I'm interested in putting together this strategy is how can we assist people of goodwill to become involved and be supportive of the drive to reduce rough sleeping. And so we've been looking around at what other countries do, and there are some quite interesting approaches whereby cities actually provide a service to ordinary people who want to get involved. And I'm encouraged that the City of Melbourne is starting to go down this path, but it's not more generally across metropolitan Melbourne or across Victoria. And that's something that I really want to try to do, because there are lots of people of goodwill but really not quite sure how they go about doing it in a productive way.
Yes.
If you look back over the last decade or so, there's been many, many inquiries about this same issue, and I see the problem still there and probably will be there in years to come. My question is, why doesn't the Christian organisations all unite and take a lead role, rather than waiting for councils and state governments and federal governments to take some, because what happens is the governments change and their policies change, and they are prone not to want to accept any responsibility for what's happened. So I think the Christian churches and other organisations who are non-Christian churches should be taking more of a consolidated role and taking a lead role, as opposed to waiting for something else to happen.
Thank you. Tony, you said 2/3 of homeless people are originating in the suburbs and country towns. If you could, what would be the first thing you would do in those places to avoid the migration to the CBD?
I don't think people take into account, okay, Grand City, we've got lots of people and lots of different places they can go for help. In rural settings, especially Swan Hill comes to mind, there's one provider. And if you muck up with them, you got nothing. Maybe more choices in the rural areas, and it would probably stop this migration to the city. It's the city lights, the people around, the safety, CCTV. Like I said earlier, we are social creatures, and that's just in our makeup. So we want to not congregate, but group around. And if there were answers in the rural areas, I'm sure these people want to live with their family and friends, because there's nothing there for them. There's more providers in rural areas, for sure.
So I think the answer to the issue about the suburbs and the country areas is pretty simple. They need much greater service infrastructure. Historically, the big organisations in the work in this field have been inner-urban based, and when there is media attention brought to the issue, then they generally, the response is to say, well, more resources and we'll deal with the issue, but it's all in the inner-urban area. And I'm certainly not advocating more service infrastructure in the inner-urban area. The service infrastructure has to get placed into key suburban settings and to country areas. The problem in the country is particularly difficult because they have high prevalence rates, there's very little service infrastructure. As one person who'd been sleeping rough told me that in a country town well, there is no services here for the homeless. And I said, well, hang on, I've just been talking to one this morning, and they made the point, yes, they're here every second Thursday afternoon. That doesn't work too well. So we've got to, and of course then there's the tyranny of distance in the country areas. Just, you know, how do you get people to and from? So we have to, as in most of the issues of poverty and disadvantage, people are doing it the toughest in the country areas.
But I think on the question of what more can the churches do, I think there's always more that we should be seeking to do. We've been a long-term partner with an earlier state government initiative in providing affordable housing. We have probably about 100 accommodation units across sites at East Melbourne, Burnley, Ringwood, Oakley, Seaford, and probably some others are just not immediately coming to mind, which are providing low-cost housing for people who otherwise would be unable to afford the market. Now that, you know, we probably quickly get to a capacity of how many of these we've been able to build, and that was an earlier state government initiative. But many of our caring agencies really have started that impulse, even like our Anglican aged care organisation, Benetas, started as the Anglican Homes for the Aged, and my predecessor, Joseph Booth, I think was really distressed to see returned men from the Second World War who were facing questions of trauma and housing insecurity, and he established that, and again places were built to be low-cost accommodation. Father Tucker, through the Brotherhood of St Laurence, was incredibly passionate and established in a way like, you know, little model kind of villages for poor people in the Geelong area and on the Mornington Peninsula. And still the Brotherhood of St Laurence is involved in providing important aged care for people who have had periods of homelessness and are otherwise homeless, and we're seeking to redevelop that facility now at Clifton Hill at Samble Lodge. So I think that there's something strongly in the DNA of at least the Anglican Church, which I know well, and I think in other Christian churches, to want to be involved in these things, and we're involved in it through the practical things that you've heard about, but also through advocacy and I think events like this, because in a way we're going to face this, like other social issues, by whole of community response, more so than the technocratic and saying, well, this is your department, you go and manage this. We've really got to have, I think, society like ours, with the resources we have, if we have determination, we have an ability to make, and we want to be in it for the long haul, as Tony has said. We've got the opportunity of making significant inroads into people's lives, and for those lives to be richer and more productive for them and the community they're part of.
Actually, I would like to say something there too. It seems to me that if we're going to be impatient about the intractable nature of this problem, and we should be impatient, the place to start is not with the churches, who from the very beginning of settlement have been intimately involved in all sorts of provision out of love and care, and are still doing so, both in cooperation with the state authorities and by themselves. I have been out with the Archbishop to a number of parishes, and I've been hugely impressed at what ordinary people are doing on their own initiative to help and to get involved, and it encourages me. You must have seen that too, Tony, and these things are both required. Yeah, as you said. Anyway, look, I'm sorry, I mustn't get on a hobby horse. It's 8:44. Perhaps, Archbishop, you would like to close for us.
Thanks for, I didn't have a chance to hear the people who are involved in their own grassroots experiences, but thanks for those of you I know who are, and thanks for your interest and participation this morning. I think, as you can see, there's a lot that we need to do to raise expectation about this, and I think we can start with a strong and a powerful vision of what human dignity really is like, and what we should expect of ourselves and each other and in our society, because that's what it just is, the corporate expression of who we are and what we expect. So I'm going to close in a prayer, so maybe you'd like to join me as I pray. We thank you, Lord Jesus, that we can affirm the image and likeness in which all people have been made in the image of God and with all of the potentials and opportunities for flourishing. And we repent when we see people whose lives have been crippled in any way by homelessness or other things. We ask that as a society we might be more humane, more compassionate, and have a higher expectation of what we can do. We pray for those people who are homeless today, who have tough choices that they make, that you would keep them safe, give them wisdom and discretion, and be with those who engage with them, that there might be an opportunity of dignified contact and one which really does make a difference. And we pray that as a whole society we might have a determination to confront these challenging issues and be committed to seeing people live with housing stability and with dignity. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thanks for your participation.